Welcome back to Faith in Question. Have you ever made a mistake in front of the entire world? Well, that's what I'm afraid that I did when I made my video a few weeks ago about Noah's Ark and the flood and the issues and reasons why I believe the flood couldn't have happened. But I'm not afraid to say when I get something wrong, so I want to go back through that. I've taken feedback from the comments, and I think there was something I definitely got wrong with that video. So we're going to do that today, but you're going to want to stick around until the end of the video because before I wrap this video up, I am going to predict exactly what Christians are going to put in the comments of this video about this mistake that I've made. So let's get into it. If you missed my video about Noah's Ark and the flood, we were looking at Genesis chapter 6 and 7, and we went through the entire story of the flood. But I made a mistake when I went through the 5 reasons why I believe the flood couldn't have happened for scientific reasons. Now, what was my mistake? Well, now after reading all of your comments, I have realized that I never should have included all 5 of those scientific evidences because I simply didn't have the time to go into enough detail with each one to be able to give you the accurate reasons as to why scientifically each of those actually holds water. I should have just picked one of them. And the lesson that I'm learning here is that if you believe in miracles, if you believe in a God who created the universe, then anything is possible. Well, almost anything. We looked at 5 reasons that the flood couldn't have happened, and number 1 was geology, where if we take a close look, we can see that it just doesn't tell the story that the Bible wants to tell. But if you believe in miracles, it's very easy to say, God could have made it that way. Or we look at geology and we see evidence of the flood everywhere. My second point was the DNA. We just don't see a bottleneck of DNA going back to just 4,500 years ago for the entire human population. But I saw comments from folks who said God could have designed us that way. He could have designed our DNA that way. Another point that we talked about was the water problem, where there literally isn't enough water in our entire global system to be able to cover the top of Mount Everest. But again, folks said the God who made the universe could easily solve this water problem. Oh, and by the way, maybe the mountains hadn't been created yet. And we also talked about the logistics of the flood. How do you feed all those animals? What about ventilation for a 3-story ark with 1 small window? And how do those animals from remote islands actually get all the way to the ark? But I read over and over again in the comments that again, if you believe in miracles, then none of these are problems because God could have made that happen if he wanted to. So the big lesson that I'm learning here is that if you believe in miracles, then anything is possible. Well, again, almost anything. Because God doesn't lie, right? He always tells the truth. Numbers 23 and verse 19 says that God is not a man that he should lie. So it's not possible for God to lie at all. Right? Well, this leads me into what I got wrong about that video because there was one piece of evidence that nobody seemed to have an answer for. That nobody in the comments could have a real rebuttal to, even though the other 4 points that I made got picked apart in the comments by Christians all over the world. And that point that I made was that civilizations had been going on before the flood all over the world, and they continued after the flood all over the world. Now, the Bible told us in Genesis chapter 7, verses 22 and 23, that everything that breathed had died. Every living thing. And the only people left, it's very clear, the only people left were Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives. That's 8 people, no more. There couldn't have been any other civilizations within this story. That's what the Bible says. And we just established that God can't lie. So that had to happen. So this is where you get to the problem of if you believe in miracles. Because if you believe in miracles, then anything should be possible. But God also says that he can't lie. So it can't be possible that there were other civilizations that existed during this time period all over the world, and that we have proof of their existence, and for this story to actually be true. That isn't possible, and this should have been what my video was about. So today we're going to take a quick look at the proof where we know that these civilizations existed around the world, and then I'm going to predict what Christians are going to say in the comments at the end of this video. Now in my video, we talked about 3 different people groups. We talked about the Egyptians, we talked about the Sumerians, and we talked about the people in the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan. But I'm just going to focus on the evidence we have for the Egyptian civilization today, and the fact that we know it predated this flood in 2500 BC and continued without a hitch after 2500 BC. I'll stick with the Egyptian culture because we have the most written down, the most evidence, the most proof. Yes, we have Sumeria, we have the Indus Valley. Those can be disputed. There's a lot of evidence there too, but I'm going to focus today's episode on Egypt. So how do we know that the Egyptians were actually thriving during this time period? There is a slew of evidence out there that archaeologists and Egyptologists have been working on, but I'm just going to focus on 3 pieces of evidence for you to keep things simple. First and foremost, we have all seen the pyramids around Egypt, and we have a dating system to be able to understand when they were built. The Great Pyramid was built by the pharaoh Khufu between 2580 and 2560 BC. Now, this wasn't the first pyramid built, and it wasn't the last pyramid built, so they had been developing this skill for many years before that, as you would expect with something as spectacular as the Great Pyramid. And there are many other types of structures that we find in Egypt that date back to this time period, but the pyramids are one that everybody knows, so let's just stick with that. Now that proves that the Egyptians were active during this time period, 2500 BC, when the flood is supposed to have happened. But we also have evidence of their culture from far before that, before 3000 BC. Now the Narmer palette is an artifact that dates back to 3100 BC that depicts the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt coming together under the pharaoh Narmer. This is centuries before the flood is supposed to have happened, but we see evidence of a very sophisticated political system to be able to bring all of Egypt together under one ruler. And we also have Egyptian writing to look back on from as early as 3200 BC in the form of hieroglyphs. This was a complex writing system that began all the way back then, but continued to mature in the centuries that followed leading up to 2500 BC. So we've got pyramids, we've got the Narmer palette, and we have these hieroglyphs to look back at that show us that Egypt was active before 2500 BC, and this continued because the Egyptians, one thing about them, God love them, they wrote everything down. So we have access to go back and look at this today. This is real evidence of a civilization that predates the flood and continues after the flood. How is that supposed to work with this biblical story? You can't wish this one away with a miracle because God can't lie. He said that everybody died, but it looks like everybody wasn't dead, or maybe this story didn't happen to begin with. Now, the biggest issue with the flood is that if this flood happened around 2500 BC, then none of this stuff that we see in Egypt should still exist. The pyramids should be absolutely destroyed, and the writings and any evidence of this civilization at all would have disappeared completely. So this is rock solid evidence that we have that this story just doesn't seem possible. And I asked many people in the comments to explain this one to me. Give me a real explanation for it, and I didn't get a single answer that was actually able to take this fact and work with it. Now, I said at the beginning of the video I was going to predict what the comments would actually be from Christians taking a hard look at this evidence, so that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. Argument number 1 they're going to make in the comments is I have the date wrong and the flood must be much older than 2500 BC. And this is one that I'll never really understand, because if you are a biblical literalist, one of the people who says that the flood must be true, well, the Bible is also literal when it tells you the years of when things would have happened and what has happened since then. The math problem is not all that hard. I've done it myself when I was studying theology in school, to go back from the genealogies and the timelines that exist in the Bible to find out when these events actually happened. It would have had to be around 2500 BC if you want to read this story literally. If you don't want to take it literally, then the flood doesn't have to be literal either. So if you're a biblical literalist, then it had to have been around 2500 BC when this flood would have happened. Now, the other argument people make about this one is that, well, maybe a year wasn't a year. Maybe they were counting years differently than we count years today. So this is an interesting one, because it would explain a lot if people didn't have to be 600 years old or 900 years old. Maybe they were counting a lunar year versus a solar year. There's a bunch of different ways that they could have done it. But you run into a problem again here. It's interesting to me that the same people who want to say maybe we're using the wrong standard of time and a year isn't a year are also the same people who are looking at the Israelites in Egypt and the Exodus, and they're saying, oh look, we have physical evidence that this happened around 1450 BC, right when the Bible said it was supposed to be. Or they're trying to prove the Bible to some of their friends who don't believe, and they look at the Bible where in 722 BC we see the fall of Sumeria and the wars that were going on there with the Assyrians, and they say, look, this is proof that the Bible is true and historical, right when the Bible said it should be. But when I tell you that the flood happened in 2500 BC and that doesn't line up with the real evidence that we have, you say, oh, maybe a year's not a year. That one doesn't make sense to me. Now, argument number 2 also has to do with the timeline, but they'll say, Rob, the Egyptians were known to exaggerate. So they really didn't predate the flood in 2500 BC. Everything you see in Egypt today and all the writings you see in Egypt must have all happened after the flood. That would explain the narrative. So 2500 BC forward is when these things happened. Now, first of all, this isn't really in dispute by any of the sciences. So anyone who's actually serious about this is not going to be able to come up with a real scientific conclusion here. We know when the writings and artifacts that we find are actually from. Now, it's true, they didn't always write the date down in the same way that we would write it today, but they told us who was king, and they told us in what year of that king's reign these things actually happened. That was how they did their dating system back then, and it works just fine for us to be able to extrapolate the year. But that's not the only place that we're looking for to validate it. They tell us when it happened, but then we have multiple sciences that we can use to verify if that's true. One of the first ways is stratigraphy, where we can look at the layers and order of things as they're dug up to see if they confirm if the date lines up with when we think these artifacts should be from. And that lines up in this case. But we also have radiocarbon dating to be able to go ahead and test the materials that we find. And that also seems to line up in this case. Now I know if you're a Christian, you are pre-programmed to say,
radiocarbon dating is wrong. It's been debunked multiple times.
And it hasn't, but keep in mind, this is only one of the ways that we are confirming this date. We have stratigraphy, we have radiocarbon dating, and we also have other methods. Egyptologists have actually been able to look at pottery found all over Egypt, and they found that this pottery aligns to a different time frame and it develops as the Egyptian civilization moves forward. This is another method that we're using to confirm the dates that we're coming up with the artifacts that we find that happen to really contradict the Bible. And lastly, we have astronomical alignments. When the Egyptians used to build temples and other structures, they would align these temples perfectly with astronomical symbols in the sky. And we know that as the Earth wobbles on its axis, that what we see in the sky actually changes over time. So when we look at the temples they built and the constellations that they point to, again, that confirms the time period of everything that we're finding here. So the Egyptians didn't exaggerate their years. All this stuff didn't happen after 2500 BC. It happened when they said it was supposed to happen. We have multiple systems to make sure we have the right dating system here. So what's more likely? That all of these methods are wrong, or that this story isn't 100% literally true like it's supposed to be? Another problem you run into if you say that the flood happened and then the Egyptian civilization came to be is, who actually built these pyramids? And when were they actually built? Because if they were built back close to 2500 BC, then that means that Noah and his 3 sons somehow went down to Egypt and learned how to build these amazing structures. That would have been hard enough on its own, but there are other areas around the world that we mentioned in Sumeria and the Indus Valley where they also would have had to be building stuff around that same time period as well. The math just isn't adding up here, but go ahead and put that argument into the comments where everybody can see it. And the third and final argument we're going to find in the comments is there's going to be some who say, look, Rob, I can't explain the timeline. That doesn't make sense to me. It could have been before, it could have been after, I don't know. But we do know that all of these cultures you're talking about, Egypt, Sumeria, Indus Valley, they all have flood myths. So those myths must be confirming the case of Noah's Ark. It must have happened because everywhere around the world we find these stories of people who believe that a global flood occurred at some point in the past. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because honestly, it's a ridiculous argument. Most of these flood myths far predate the story of the flood in the Bible. We know when Moses was supposed to have written this story down, somewhere around 1400 BC. But the Sumerian story is 700 years older than that, and many other cultures have flood myths that date way back, thousands of years before this flood was supposed to have happened. So I'm sorry, that argument's not holding water either. So there you have it. I've laid out the argument of what the comments are going to be, but I'm really interested in seeing how Christians are going to look at the proof that this story couldn't have happened. I want to see if they come up with things that maybe I haven't thought of. I would love to learn. And again, I am not above saying if I am wrong. So let me know your feedback about this episode. Leave me a comment. Let me know if you agree or disagree. And if you're looking for the original video, go ahead and check that video out right here. And if you haven't subscribed yet to our channel, go ahead and subscribe. We're putting out weekly content about all the things about the Bible, the problems in it, the contradictions, and we're going to keep these episodes coming out all year long. So that'll do it for us today. Thanks for watching another episode of Faith in Question. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time.